Well, welcome back to another Walk and Talk Faith Roots podcast. And today I'm just speaking in light of the recent death of the Pope and evangelical responses to his death. Now, it's difficult, isn't it, getting that right balance when a public and controversial figure dies. You want to get your demeanour right. You want to show appropriate respect, not just to the recently departed, but to those who cared about them, those that are grieving. And millions of people around the world are in grief at the moment because the Pope was somebody significant in their lives, just as when the Queen died, and there would have been people that would have disagreed with the concept of the monarchy, and there would have been people from other countries in the world that would have had opinions on Britain's colonial past. But for many people in Britain and in the Commonwealth, never mind immediate relatives, there was a significant sense of loss. So we want to recognise that. But also, when somebody significant and public dies, there is very quickly a lot of discussion about their legacy, about what they did, what they got right, what they got wrong. And in fact, those that supported the person tend to want to get in very quickly to secure that legacy. And indeed others, whether or not they were really supporters of the person, very quick to seek to find support for their own agenda in what that person did or didn't do. So when Pope Francis died, immediately you had people that wanted to own his legacy. Though from a progressive point of view, were very quick to pick up on the Pope's reluctance to condemn others and the moves that he had made in terms of what progressives would consider as their agenda, in terms of allowing for same-sex blessings, in a different attitude to divorcees. And in finding ways to include women in senior roles, although still being resistant to women's ordination. Others wanted to own him because they saw a spirituality there. A spirituality that seemed to share an agenda, share a cause with charismatic evangelicalism. Others were quick to sort of look at his down-to-earth approach, his relatability, the commitment that he made to a humble lifestyle. And what you're seeing there is the way in which our obituaries and our eulogies tell us more about ourselves than they do about the person that we're eulogizing. That there really are opportunity to claim the person and claim the death for ourselves. I think that means in that context that it is reasonable for those that disagreed with the Pope, and particularly those who disagree with Catholicism, to respond and to say something, to be clear about what our position is. And that's why I wanted to talk a bit about why I am still a Protestant and why evangelicals need to still be Protestants. The fascinating thing is this, that when I went to Bearwood Chapel as a pastor, I picked up that on a lot of our publicity on our website and other publicity, we introduced our church as being evangelical and Protestant. And I actually changed the publicity and I dropped the word Protestant. We were in a community with quite a significant Catholic presence. There'd been a large Irish community, and then people from Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, had come into the community. We also began to pick up on the fact that there were many Africans, Nigerians from Catholic backgrounds. And so I wasn't convinced that in terms of trying to make a link with those people, trying to share the gospel with our community, that headlining as Protestant was what we should be doing. Not because we weren't Protestant, not because we shouldn't be Protestant, but because it was really about where our emphasis needed to be. And in fact, my concern was that those people would get to hear the very things that made us Protestant, and to understand why, and to discover the joy of the gospel that brought about, rather than putting them off with a label that they would not necessarily have understood and would have just seen in quite aggressive terms, and perhaps associated, if you were Irish background, particularly with the sectarianism and discrimination of Northern Ireland. But one of the things I've been picking up on in the responses as the death of the Pope has held up this mirror to us is it's highlighted, I think, a confusion within evangelicalism about how we're to regard the Pope and regard Catholicism today. We've seen a number of responses. Now, some of them have been triumphalist, some of them have been very much along the lines of this was an enemy and he's dead and we rejoice. I've seen some nitpicking, some straining at gnats. One person commented that when someone dies, we hope to see them in heaven, and there was an immediate response from another person of, "Hey, you can't talk about seeing people in heaven. That's heresy." But not because we were uncertain about the Pope's faith, and that person didn't seem to have questioned it, but because they wanted to emphasise the resurrection of the dead. Now, I think we can talk about the resurrection of the dead, that some hope we have, whilst acknowledging that between our death and Christ's return, there will be that period when we will be with Christ in heaven. And I think Scripture does point to that being a conscious experience. There's an article in Evangelicals now, another example of what I think is a straining at gnats. Someone getting really uptight about the use of the phrase "rest in peace," and they do highlight the problems with Catholicism's lack of assurance. But really, to get fast and worked up about a sentimental phrase, rather than to really home in on what the big gospel issues are, again, seems to me to be swallowing the camel whilst straining out the nuts. And then another article appeared from Russell Moore in Christianity Today, and then was picked up by evangelicals now in the UK, which essentially said, aren't we doing a lot better these days? We Protestants and evangelicals don't talk about the Pope as the Antichrist. We try to get along with Catholics and see them as part of the church. The Catholics are a lot nicer these days. They've dealt with some of their issues that caused the Reformation to happen. That sense of we can get along well whilst agreeing to disagree on some issues. And again, it just seems to completely miss the point. And I think the issue is this. Most of us, if we are honest, do not really understand or know that much about Roman Catholicism. And so we tend to see it as just another denomination. And in an evangelical world today where the attitude is not just towards Catholicism, but to all the different strands of thinking, the different denominations, the different approaches, liberal Christianity, Anglo-Catholic Christianity, prosperity teaching, all those kinds of things, that we tend to see all of them as just different strands that get some things right and some things wrong, and we get along together and it's okay. And the risk is this, that we miss the danger because we don't really understand what those other strands actually believe. And so we see them as just variations. And part of that, again, is out of a desire to be loving and welcoming, not to be difficult and obnoxious. I think it's possible to avoid being obnoxious. I think it's possible to respect others, to recognise, as people, as Protestants and the Reformed always have, that you may belong to the Catholic Church and be a real and genuine believer in Jesus. I think there are other ways in which people can be completely muddled in their theology and true believers in Jesus. And we should be able to recognise that, but also to see a particular teaching for what it is, to see it as it is, to see that it's wrong. Now, one of the problems that I think we have is we hear language and it sounds the same as the kind of language that we would use. So if you were to take a cursory glance at Roman Catholic teaching, you would see that it would say, yes, we believe that it's Jesus' death and resurrection that saves us. We believe that that's about God's grace to us. We believe that you cannot be saved by works. We believe that justification by faith is the beginning of our salvation. And that all sounds very similar, doesn't it, to what we would say as evangelical Protestants, what we would say as Reformed Christians. So it's important to actually dig in and look at what is really meant by that.
Cheers, Scott.
And what I wanted to do today was just to try and give you an overview of the Roman Catholic understanding of the gospel and of salvation, and to get a sense of how different it is to, I was going to say to what we believe, but I want to be stronger than that, to what the Bible actually says. Now, part of the challenge here is one of the things we've been picking up on other walk and talks and videos and articles recently, is that the theology, the belief arises out of a particular worldview, this so-called classical worldview that we've been talking about. And that view of humanity. And I wonder as well whether one of the problems we have is that some people have been so desperate to recapture this so-called classical theism that they've missed some of the problems there as well, and that worldview. But let me sketch it out for you. The Catholic understanding of who we are as people is this, that we were made and we were created with two parts to our nature. A lower part, which is kind of the physical animalistic, beastly part of our nature, and then a higher self, the spiritual self, that's added in. What Adam's sin meant was that the result was a loss of that higher bit, the grace bit. So salvation is first of all about grace being added back at that higher self level. That's why you've got this idea of two types of sin, mortal sin and, I can't remember the phrase for it, but the lesser kinds of sin as well that happen at sort of the beastly level. It's why there's the confusion about whether or not our lusts are sin or not, or just tending towards sin. How does that grace happen? Well, it happens because Jesus died on the cross, and God the Father looks at his sacrifice and it pleases him, and so on the basis of that, God decides to give in return for that sacrifice, to give us grace. Now you realise at this point that's actually quite different from the understanding of Jesus taking our place, bearing our sin, dying our death, so that we receive his righteousness, so that it's imputed or credited to us. And in fact, when Catholics talk about righteousness, when they talk about justification, they talk about it being about justification, they talk about righteousness, they talk about grace being infused. It's this sort of idea of it being this substance that is infused into us, added back in where it's been missing, because Jesus' death persuades the Father to be merciful to us. And that happens at baptism. So your baptism actually saves you, makes you regenerate, you receive grace. And in fact, there are a variety of sacraments: baptism, confession, communion, marriage, the communion of the Mass specifically, marriage, and finally the last rites at death, that add this substance of grace back into your life. So here's the idea. You're born into sin, but then at your baptism, grace is infused into you, and so you are now a Christian. You have now got the possibility of making it to heaven. But the problem is that grace is this substance and it's a bit leaky, and as we live our lives, we leak out this grace through our sin. So what do we do about that? Because the risk is that if it all leaks out and then we die, then we're going to stand before God without any righteousness, because it's all gone. And so we'll be just left with our beastly selves. And so the Catholic answer to that was twofold. First of all, to give people a chance to get some of that righteousness back. And so they created this concept called purgatory, a sort of in-between place. Disturbingly, cruelly, what they also believed was that babies, unbaptized babies, would end up in this kind of limbo world in between, not really damnable to hell, but also lacking that grace, lacking that righteousness to be able to make it into heaven. But purgatory is not really, because it's a place of suffering, not a place where you want to spend a lot of time. And that was one of the things that started to build up towards the Reformation, because people were looking for ways to minimise their time in purgatory, or to minimise the time that their relatives spent in purgatory. So the church said, look, it's okay. You can shorten your time in purgatory, or shorten the time of your loved ones in purgatory, by saying prayers for them, by doing good deeds on their behalf, and here's the crucial bit, by paying something called indulgences into the church. And of course, indulgences, there's getting people to pay lots of money in to pay for the grand lifestyle of the Pope, and in fact to build that massive basilica where the Pope will be, where his funeral, where he will be, where that final mass will be said. Led to a lot of corruption. But the corruption was made possible because of a false belief. And it was that Martin Luther protested against when he nailed his document to the church door in Wittenberg. So the church began to find ways of getting people out of purgatory early, ways that of course benefited the pockets of the popes and the cardinals and the church. And it also tried to find other ways of making sure that you didn't end up there in the first place. As I've mentioned, these things called sacraments. What do you do when you go through life and you think a wrong thought, or you say something wrong, or you lie, or you get into a fight, or whatever? What do you do? Well, you know that you've leaked out some grace, leaked out some righteousness. So you try to get it topped back up again. And you can top that up by doing good deeds. That might involve going on a pilgrimage. In some strands, you've got the sort of self-flagellation type things that you may have seen in some films. Do a bit of suffering now to reduce the potential afterlife suffering. And you go to confession. And at confession, you tell the priest the wrong things that you've done, and then the priest gives you a penance to do, based on a mistranslation of repentance in the Latin Bible. And that might involve doing a good deed. It might involve saying some ritual prayers, some Hail Marys, that kind of thing, or the Lord's Prayer, Our Fathers, or whatever. But you are then absolved of your sin. You get some top up of grace, top up of righteousness. You can go to, providing you've had that level of top up, that enables you then to go to the Mass at the weekend. And again, you go and you take part, and as you receive, as you get to eat the literal body of Christ, you receive a bit more of this substance, of this righteousness, of this grace into you to top you up a bit more. Marriage is another way of topping up. It's a kind of a good deed, a sacrament that tops you up with a bit more righteousness, as is a vow of celibacy as a monk or a nun. That's another way, alternative way of getting topped up. And the other thing that you can do is this. You may still be at a deficit after all of those things, but here's some good news. There are people that have lived such good lives that they died with a surplus that had more than enough righteousness. They've got well past the finish line. I remember my daughter in her first school sports day. She was in the running race and she ran the distance that they'd set for the 5-year-olds at sort of the halfway line, and that was where she was meant to finish, but she just kept running sort of Forrest Gump style right to the very end of the track, and we had to run after her to say stop. Now imagine if someone had said, well, you know, she's run twice the length that she needs to, she's done more than enough to finish and win the race, so what about somebody who didn't make it to the end? Well, what if we take a bit of her running and add it to their account, add it to their record, if you like? Well, these people that have lived such spiritually good lives, in Catholic thinking, become known as saints. And they have special saints' days and they have special shrines. And by going to their shrines and by praying to them, you can ask for a bit of a top-up of righteousness from them. You also go to them because you can look to them along with the Virgin Mary as being a bit closer to us than God, a bit closer to us even than Jesus. So they act as a mediator and go-between, because Jesus might still be cross at us for bad things that we've done, but Mary or the saints might put a good word in for us. And then finally, you're at death's door. And as you're dying, there's that concern, have you got enough righteousness, enough grace in you, in your account, to get you through that last hurdle? So just in case, to top up, you have the last rites, you have requiem masses, and those kinds of things, just to give you that final top up on your way. Now, I hope you followed that through. That might have been a bit sort of confusing at times. If it's confusing, it's because the whole system is confusing, and because it reflects this very different worldview, this kind of Aristotelian sort of worldview, and also because I want to suggest it is something that looks a bit like the Christian gospel. But what you should be picking up at this stage is that whilst it uses some of the same vocabulary, some of the same terms, whilst it touches on some of the same sorts of events, Jesus' death and resurrection, baptism, the communion, all those kinds of things, actually it is talking about something different. It's a different gospel. Now, that raises some challenges, doesn't it? The first thing to say is this. I've known far too many people who have, in what we call cradle Catholics, they've been baptised as babies, they've been brought up in Catholic families, they've been sent to Catholic school, they've been taken to Mass, And they have picked up that this isn't good news. And they picked up that the God that is overseeing that system seems pretty, finicky or even harsh and cruel. My own father-in-law, who was a cradle Catholic, would often say that he did believe that there was a God, but the God that he had been introduced to in that Catholic system was a monster. And he hated that God. So a lot of damage has been done as people have been turned away from God, turned away from the gospel by this religious system. Secondly, there are people, I think many people within the Catholic Church, who despite all of that seem to end up knowing and loving Jesus. And that's why I said at the start, I believe that it's possible. I believe that there are potentially many Catholics who are true believers in Jesus. But their faith and their salvation is in effect due to an inconsistency. That what they actually believe in reality is very different from the theory that their church teaches. But crucially what it means is this: that the very things that made the Reformation necessary are true today as well. That whatever we might think about the personal faith of individual Catholics, we have to be clear that what the Roman Catholic Church teaches is a different gospel. And it is unloving and a failure of grace and compassion if we don't make that clear. But what does that mean about how we respond to the death of a pope? Well, I think that we can, as we would with many people alive and dead, we can admire aspects of his life that we can admire. There does seem to have been some form of humility, the compassion towards the poor and the needy. We can admire what seems to have been a general gentleness and a concern for others. But we also have to be absolutely clear that it isn't doing better to play down the differences, that we cannot ignore that the gospel that he taught is not the gospel. And I'm concerned our prayer needs to be not for him, but for many Catholics today, that they would find true saving faith in Jesus Christ alone.